Well, moving on to the local consumer confidence index, it showed an improvement from -7 to -6 index points during the first quarter of this year. Joining us now for more is Sizwe Nxedlana, chief economist at FNB. And Alec looks at me with a smile on his face. I won't say why this time, but nonetheless, Sizwe, let's get into the numbers.
No, but Sizwe's with FNB, he's got Nedbank's tie on. I wonder if he's telling us something.
Planning a move?
No, not at all.
Not anytime soon. Well, taking a look at the numbers, what was interesting for me was the commentary where you compared this to the levels that we saw back in 2008 with the financial crisis. How do they compare?
Yeah, so yes, we are at levels that show a significant lack of confidence at the moment. In the last 8 quarters, we've essentially had consumer confidence negative in 7 of those 8 quarters. And I think it signifies a confluence of factors that essentially began in the second half of 2008 when we had the flare-up of the Eurozone debt crisis, and then very soon in the quarter that followed, the domestic risks as labor unrest flared up following Marikana. And essentially since then, there hasn't been an abatement of either labor unrest or some sort of global flare-up. Over and above that, we've also seen a lot of the things that were driving consumer income since 2009 lose steam. And I'm talking here about unsecured lending, I'm talking about massive increases in government spending, and more recently higher interest rates and the signal that we might get more. And that has led to a decline or a moderation rather in household real disposable incomes. And I think the consumer confidence numbers being negative for such a long time signal that, and the fact that they are negative at levels that are close to what happened during the Great Recession and even what happened during load shedding just substantiates the fact that consumers are not very happy at the moment.
It's not a good time to have an election, if you think about it. If consumers aren't happy, they like to vote for the people who are in power when they're happy. Now they're not happy. Do you think we're going to see a reflection of this?
Well, I don't know that there's a direct correlation between electoral results and consumer confidence, just like there's not necessarily a direct correlation between a flare-up in service delivery protests and what actually transpires in the election.
Our country is different then, because I can tell you what an Obama or a Tony Blair or one of the Western politicians would look at these numbers and say, no election now, thank you. But getting to those 3 questions that you ask, the one that jumps at you is it time to buy durable goods, furniture, cars, etc. And that seems to be going in very much the wrong direction.
Yes, and I think it ties in with what's actually happening within the spending components of durable goods. I mean, those are coming off. If you look at the vehicle sales figures, those are coming off. And we're starting to see some softness in the demand for property also following the interest rate hike. So I think consumers are looking at what's happening, and they are essentially telling us that they're going to adopt a defensive posture, and even more of a defensive posture than what has transpired in previous quarters. And if you break down the survey by income levels, what you find is that high income consumers are actually okay. If you look at what they're telling us about their own finances. So at the high income levels, consumers are saying we're not that negative about our own finances. In fact, they're reasonably positive. I think at the level of rating of own finances is only slightly below the long-term average, 8 versus 12. But when you go to low-income households, they are outright bearish. So now is not a good time to buy durables. We don't like the prospects of the economy, and our own finances are coming under pressure. And if you look at where the problems have occurred as they pertain to household consumption, the slowdown in unsecured lending, or rather the tightening of credit criteria on unsecured lending products, the fact that government is beginning to slow down on public sector employment, the fact that government is slowing down and that could negatively impact social grants. And if you look at where the upward pressures on the CPI have been, they've been in the components of the basket that I would argue low-income households are most exposed to. And again, if you look at the company results, it seems that the companies that tend to cater for higher income households are doing slightly better than those that cater to lower income households. So it seems pressure is particularly acute amongst the lower income households. If I can mention one last thing, even if you look at the NCR data, non-performing loans on mortgages, so presumably people who have mortgages are people that tend to be in higher income segments, they've actually been trending down. And it tells you that there's this disparity between high income households that are okay and low income households that are not that happy.
That strikes me because one thing that's always been peculiar is how these miners who are striking in the platinum belt are surviving, and many of them are going back home, living off of their livestock as well as off of the land. Surely that's not sustainable.
But did you read Peter Bruce's piece? He actually wrote it from the Transkei this last week, and he was saying it's chaos out there in the areas behind where his family's holiday home has been, that people who previously were relying on this income of now having to go to the cities to try and find work which doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned that fact that also the labor unrest, to the extent that it's continued for an extended period. If you look at where unemployment has been, I think we created 40,000 formal jobs last year, but sectorally the split was quite interesting. So the sectors that have suffered a lot from labor unrest are where the jobs were shed. So mining, manufacturing, and also transport and logistics. And I think that those sectors also tend to be more intensive in unskilled labor, and the strikes are amongst unskilled workers. And that also ties into the fact that obviously to the extent that you embark on strike action, you may lose some income, and it ties back to the fact that you then reflect that as an outright bearishness in your consumer confidence and also in your rating of your own financial
Many people rely on
prospects.
those jobs. He's going to get into trouble. He's just said we created 40,000 jobs last year, not 507,000.
So I said formal jobs. So there's a difference between the quarterly labor force survey, which is asking
we can't go there now. That 507,000.
But maybe this is a good indicator, because we spoke to you recently about the dire situation regarding the construction index, and now the consumer index is also showing a dip. So are we going to make any jobs this year or create any jobs?
Look, I think overall there's a silver lining here. So our overall theme for the sort of 2-year ahead forecast outlook is underperformance and adjustment. What are we adjusting from? A large current account deficit. So let's say minus 5% of GDP, or between 150 and 200 billion rands. And that reflects a gap between expenditure, which has significantly outperformed income. Now, if you are a household and you need to adjust from that, two things need to happen. You need to tighten the belt on expenditure, and you need to make more money. For a country, that translates into slower expenditure. And that's what's being reflected by these consumer confidence
numbers. So we're adjusting,
numbers.
the rebalancing is happening.
Exactly, and if you look at the current account deficits come from -6 to -5. If you look at the employment volumes and employment values, the current account is adjusted because imports fell by about 4% in terms of value, and exports rose by about 1%. So that adjustment is happening, but along with it comes softer domestic expenditure.